The rain fell lightly on the garden, illuminated only by the yellow light of the street lamps reflecting off the wet stones. He arrived with firm steps, wearing the dark suit she so admired, his heart racing as if he were about to hear the answer that would change everything. In his pocket, a ring held the weight of a decision. The words written in the letter still echoed in her mind. "I'll wait for you in the garden." It was nearly midnight, and the chilly air held an anticipation that seemed to suspend time. But when his eyes met the silhouette in the background, his body froze. It wasn't her. It was someone he'd never expected to see there, and that person's smile held not love, but the silent promise that something dark was about to happen. For a moment he wanted to believe it was a mistake, that in a few seconds she would appear, breathless, explaining everything, dispelling the strange presence that now stared at him in the center of the garden. But the woman before him, in the red, dress and sharp gaze, took just one step forward, and the light revealed a detail that made his blood run cold. In her hand, the same envelope he had sent days before, torn. The silence between them became suffocating, and the distant sound of footsteps echoing down the stone corridor seemed to announce that other truths were coming. Truths that would leave no time for explanations, only for choices. And in that instant, he realized there was no going back. There is still a lot of this story for you, so leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this story. Night fell over New York, a blanket of silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic sound of rain beating against the windows. In the luxurious apartment of a historic building, he sat alone at a mahogany desk, staring at the open letter before him as if the words could move and change the fate he already sensed. He was a man accustomed to control, over business, over people, over himself. But that sentence, written in delicate handwriting, had unsettled something profound. "I'll wait for you in the garden." The garden wasn't just any place. Located at the back of an old hotel, with stone paths lined with centuries-old rose bushes, it had been the scene of encounters and goodbyes he'd never told anyone about. It felt like a refuge, and perhaps that's why the message held such weight. As he slowly swirled his whiskey glass between his fingers, he remembered her. Soft scent, the conversations that seemed to last into the early hours of the morning, and that look that always blended tenderness with a hint of challenge. It was too early to say he trusted her, and too late to deny he was already involved. The last few weeks had been a silent dance between coming closer and moving away, as if they both knew they were treading on territory that could become dangerous. And yet he would. Not just because he wanted answers, but because part of him needed to feel like he still had something real, something not tied to money, power, or the social masks that surrounded him daily. As the city moved on outside, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small black velvet box. The ring inside reflected the light with a cool, precise sheen, a bold gesture, perhaps hasty but inevitable. He took a deep breath, closed the box, and slipped it into his inside jacket pocket. As he stood, he felt the symbolic weight of each step, as if crossing the apartment door was more than just leaving. It was entering a chapter that could redefine his entire story. He took the elevator down slowly, observing his own reflection in the mirrored walls. The man staring back at him seemed confident, but there was something in his eyes that couldn't be deceived. Fear. Fear of finding, fear of losing, fear of what he might discover. And yet, when the doors opened onto the bright lobby, he didn't hesitate. He hailed a car, leaned back in the leather seat, and watched the streets pass by in flashes of light and shadow. The driver didn't ask anything, just followed the address he'd been given. And as the city turned into narrower, quieter streets, he felt every second bringing him closer, not only to her, but to a truth he might not be ready to hear. The car stopped in front of the hotel's side entrance, where a narrow stone corridor led to the garden. The rain had eased, but the air still carried that distinctive scent of wet earth and damp leaves. He got out, adjusted his jacket, and walked with firm steps, feeling the night chill seep through the expensive fabric of his suit. With each step, the yellowish streetlights cast their distorted shadows on the walls, as if warning him that he was entering uncertain territory. The wrought iron gate stood ajar, creaking slightly as it was pushed. And there, before him, the garden stretched silently, the soft sheen of puddles reflecting the leaves of the rose bushes and the hotel windows in the distance. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to capture that moment before everything changed. Memories of their previous encounters came to him like flashes, the gentle touch of her hand, the way she stared at him as if she could see through every mask, the suppressed laughter that seemed to hide secrets. But that night, there was no laughter. There was no floral scent that always announced her presence. Instead, what he saw was a silhouette standing in the center of the path, partially obscured by the shadow of an ancient tree. Her red dress drew attention even in the dim light, like a flame lit in the darkness. At first he thought it was her, and an immediate relief coursed through him. But as he approached, he realized something was off. Her rigid posture, her chin raised in a calculated manner, and that gaze, cold, almost appraising. "Were you expecting someone?" Her voice cut through the air, carrying a tone that sought not answers, but control. He didn't respond. Immediately, still trying to understand why it wasn't the woman who had written the letter, until his eyes caught a disturbing detail. In her hands, the torn envelope, damp at the edges from the rain, the same envelope he had sent days earlier, personally delivered to the woman who was now absent. The silence between them stretched, and the distant sound of water trickling through the gutters seemed to amplify the tension. She took a step forward, her heels echoing dully on the stones, and leaned in slightly as if to invade his space. "You seem disappointed." The sentence came with a discreet smile, almost imperceptible, but filled with something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. He inhaled slowly, controlling his breath so as not to show the impact those words had on him. Part of him wanted to demand an explanation. Another part wanted to retreat. But the truth was, retreating was never an option for someone accustomed to facing everything head-on, even danger. So he remained still, observing every detail of her, as if each second might offer a clue as to what was really happening. The cold wind blew, causing some petals to fall from the rose bushes and fall onto the wet stone. And in that instant, he realized he wasn't just facing an altered encounter, but the beginning of something that could carefully dismantle every piece of the life he had built. The memory came like an old smell awakened by the rain. The same garden, years before, when he still believed. Money-covered tracks. Back then, the hotel was hosting a charity event bearing his name, but it was backstage that the night had truly happened. He met a young kitchen worker with clear eyes and hands marked with detergent, who dared to say what no one else would, that his foundation had quietly destroyed small businesses by acquiring buildings and raising rents with luxury renovations. He laughed to himself, offered tips, talked beautifully about social impact. Days later, he signed the document that accelerated the sale of an entire block in Queens. You saw no faces, only numbers. The newspaper ran an article with a protest photo he never forgot. A woman in a red coat standing in front of the trucks, her hands raised, the letters of a banner blurred by the rain. He closed the page, piled on more work, and moved on. That color, that gesture, that look had pierced the years like a pin in the right place of a wrong memory. Now, before him, red had its own name and surgical precision. The woman in the garden wasn't a mistake, she was a return. She touched the envelope with her fingertips, as if holding proof and sentence at the same time, and said that letters are lost when you don't learn to listen to the ones that came first. The sentence fell on him with the weight of all the times he'd looked away from consequences. The woman he'd been waiting for, the one who wrote with soft handwriting and breathed tenderness, had appeared in his life weeks before, as if bringing a respite to the noise he carried inside. They'd connected all too quickly, because she had a rare way of remaining silent without disappearing, of arguing without shouting. He felt there was something there that couldn't be bought. Respect. And perhaps that's why he'd pulled out of the vault the old idea of the future, with its ring and promise, except that the threads of stories aren't straight lines. They're ties that tighten where it hurts. The woman in red's face wasn't unfamiliar. He recognized it from the hallways of hearings and news reports, from cold emails sent by lawyers, that began with, "On behalf of my client." They didn't know each other's names, but they knew the part of each other that hurt. He remembered the afternoon he skipped a meeting with residents to sign an agreement with the city council. He remembered the night the security team alerted him to a troublemaker following his steps to the sidewalk outside his office. He remembered how well he slept even then. And he remembered, most of all, an anonymous letter he'd received that year, written with the same delicacy that now seemed familiar. "One day, the garden will no longer be just a backdrop." He filed it away. The past, however, isn't archived when it finds an echo outside. The rain eased as if offering a listening ear. She spoke again, and each word had the texture of someone who'd waited too long. She explained that the message that had brought him there wasn't entirely hers, that stories sometimes need a borrowed hand to find the right culprit. The name he had protected as if it were new, hers, was tied to an ancient history, and the woman in red was the bridge between these two shores. She was the sister of one of the evicted families, a philanthropist of a kind he had scorned because her photo wasn't in the society column, the persistent voice that had asked for meetings and received silence. And, ironically, she was also the closest friend of the one he believed he could love. The garden breathed with them. He realized belatedly that letters that change destinies are not written with ink, but with the weight of gestures that return. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the fear that came not from losing a contract, but from looking into the eyes of a story that had finally come to collect its bill. He reached for the torn envelope, but she recoiled with a barely perceptible movement, as if holding not just a piece of paper, but the key to an invisible safe. A fine rain dripped from her hair to her neck, trickling down the fabric of her dress, each droplet seeming to mark the passage of time he could no longer control. She calmly opened the envelope, pulled out a crumpled sheet, and, without looking away, began to read aloud. Not the words he had written, but excerpts from another letter, one he had never seen, dated almost 10 years earlier. The handwriting was shaky, but the sentences were firm. They described cold nights in makeshift tea. Shelters, families driven from their homes, children carrying cardboard boxes like toys. They spoke of promises of resettlement that were never fulfilled, and of an elegant man who signed without looking you in the eye. With each word, the weight of his silence at that time grew more unbearable. "Do you remember?" she asked, folding the paper slowly, as if closing a chapter so as never to forget. "This letter was written by my mother." He tried to answer, but no voice came. The past, until then, kept hidden in locked drawers, was there, exposed under the dim light of the garden, and the cruelest thing was knowing that none of it could be denied. She continued speaking, now with an almost calm tone, which was worse than any scream. She told how her mother fell ill shortly after the expulsion, how the family scattered throughout the city, and how she herself learned too early that some wounds never heal. She said she didn't expect justice from the courts, they have masters, but that she wanted something more precious, for him to remember, that he would carry every day the image of those who remained outside. As he listened, he realized that the envelope he had received that week, with the phrase, "I'll wait for you in the garden," it hadn't been the work of a single person. The woman he believed he loved had written, yes, but under the influence of this silent presence, which stitched together the encounter so that the story would inevitably come to a close. In his inner pocket, the ring now seemed like a useless weight. There was no room for romantic gestures amidst open scars. He began to understand that the garden, that night, was not the setting for a beginning, but for a reckoning. The wind blew stronger, causing the rose bushes to bend and scatter petals onto the sodden ground. She then slowly put the envelope back in her bag and turned as if she were about to leave. But she stopped, looked over her shoulder, and said, "You always believed that some stories die in silence. This one doesn't." And in that instant, he knew he hadn't heard everything yet, that there was another letter, another voice, and perhaps even another presence that night. The garden suddenly seemed smaller, as if the shadows at the edges were moving. The garden seemed to close in around them as she took 2 steps back, and the streetlight drew a third silhouette on the ground that wasn't either of them. He noticed it first by the absence of sound, The wind had died. The rain had turned to a nearly motionless drizzle, and yet a shadow advanced over the stones with the clarity of something that respects no distance. It was then that he noticed, high on the hotel wall, a red dot blinking discreetly, like the eye of a camera someone had just activated. The feeling of being watched didn't come only from the woman in the red dress. It came from everywhere, from someone who was learning to wait outside until the right time took its toll. He reached for the pocket, where the ring weighed and reflexively closed his fingers, as if trying to protect the last gesture that still made him believe in the future. But he stopped his movement when he saw in the distance a black umbrella moving unhurriedly down the side alley. There were no open umbrellas. The rain barely existed. That object was a warning. The woman noticed too. Her gaze shifted from his face to the avenue and then returned with a serenity possessed only by those who have spent many nights together. She said that if he wanted, they could leave and pretend nothing had happened. He understood the poison behind the kindness. Pretending was what he had always done best. The shadow approached, now revealing a thin man in a dark suit, hands in his pockets, the kind of presence that goes unnoticed in Manhattan lobbies and yet knows everyone's name. He didn't speak. He leaned against the stone column and lit a cigarette he hadn't smoked, the smoke rising straight up like the lines of a report. The red dot of the camera fixed on them. Somewhere in the building, someone was watching. He felt the humiliation come like a chill that rises within him. He was on his own symbolic ground, the place of his chosen meetings, the time he determined, the gesture he planned. And yet he was an extra in a scene written by others. He tried to regain control by inquiring about the absence of the woman he was waiting for, asking where she was, if she was okay, if that letter had been a trap from the start. The answer came like a velvet-wrapped blade. She was nearby, listening, guarded by someone who understood that certain truths need to be seen to hurt, not spoken to escape. He felt his heart race, a mixture of anger and fear making his mouth dry. The woman in red tilted her face, her hair dripping with almost invisible water, and told him, with a calm that was painful, that her friend had read every word he had written and that, for that very reason, she was not there. It's dangerous to bring what is true closer to what you still represent, she said, and the pronoun you carried more weight than any accusation. The man with the umbrella tapped his wrist twice, as if marking time for someone on the other side. In the second-story window, a curtain moved and stopped, a third open, a third closed, the precise fraction in which witnesses are kept. The garden, which had always seemed like a setting for intimacy, suddenly became a silent arena, with an invisible audience and a script that didn't belong to him. Near the rose bushes, one of the stone slabs was displaced, creating a slight drop where water pooled. The reflection showed, for an instant, 3 distorted figures, his being the smallest. He took a deep breath and said that justice isn't born of theatre, that he was willing to make amends for anything, that life had taught him the cost. She smiled mirthlessly, as if she'd heard offers of reparations piled on ruins, and replied that costs don't buy nights. That money doesn't restore voices, that letters read late can only rearrange blame. The man with the umbrella stubbed out his cigarette without having smoked it and disappeared behind the column. But the shadow remained, as if absorbed by the wall itself. The red dot blinked faster, then stabilized, and he understood they were recording, that this conversation would have a purpose, that someone would tell this story without letting it dissolve into excuses. A metallic sound echoed from the mwai. Gate, not a creak, but the resolute click of an electric lock, and for a second he feared he was trapped in his own garden. The woman noticed the start and said that doors lock when you decide to stay, not when you learn to leave. And that was when, for the first time, he felt small in a way money couldn't, understanding that the danger wasn't in being exposed, but in finally being seen. The light enveloped them in a patchy halo, and the scent of wet earth mingled with the distant odor of rust, reminding him that everything ages, even guilt, if left alone too long. The night wasn't over, just moved a step forward, and with it, the certainty that something or someone was still missing for the bill to be complete. He didn't immediately realize they were no longer alone. The presence came as an echo, not a sound, a slight shift of air, the reflection of something moving between the stone columns that lined the garden. The woman in red looked away for a moment, and it was then that he understood. Someone was approaching from the back path, the one that led to the service gate. There were no hurried footsteps, nor the urgency of someone arriving to intervene. It was the controlled walk of someone who already knows they have the final say. When the figure emerged from the shadows, the first thing he saw was her face. The same face he'd expected that night. The face he'd believed was missing, protected in some faraway room. But something was different. Her eyes lacked the tenderness he knew. They were steady, almost stern, as if she'd passed through a place from which one naively cannot return. The light-colored dress she wore clashed with the heavy atmosphere, but it was precisely this light that made the scene all the more unsettling. He took a step toward her, but was stopped by a quick gesture of her hand demanding distance. "I didn't come for what you thought," he said, his voice unshaken. "I came for what you need to hear." The words fell like glass to the floor, each one reflecting a different angle of the truth. She said she knew about the meeting, knew about the envelope, and knew what was behind it. She said that when she received his letter, she also received another, one that told the story he had always avoided hearing. The woman in red, his closest friend, had shown her documents, records, photos. There was no room for doubt. He tried to explain himself, but it felt like he was speaking into a wall that wouldn't resonate. Her voice cut through every attempt at defense with precise facts, dates, names, and the more he listened, the more he realized the line between what was past and what was happening now was non-existent. "You gave me reason to believe you were different," she continued, "but the man I saw in those papers is not the man I thought I knew." He felt the silent blow of those words, as if he had been punched in the chest. The woman in red then approached, completing the circle around him. Now the three of them stood, under the same yellowish light of the street lamp, and for the first time he realized that their physical position said more than any sentence. He in the center, two witnesses at the ends, as if in an open-air courtroom. It was then that she, the woman he had come to meet, pulled a small velvet box from her bag, the same one he had planned to open that night. Only now she was the one holding it. "You were going to give this to me, weren't you?" he asked, with a half-smile that didn't hide the pain. "Well, I'm giving it back. Not because I don't want to, but because you can't build a future on soil flooded with poorly buried stories." The sound of the box's latch closing echoed through the garden like a warning. And in that instant, he understood that he wasn't just losing a moment or a relationship. He was facing the first movement of a long fall, in which all the doors that had always opened for him would begin, one by one, to close. He tried to find within himself the man who knew how. To choose words, but it was a memory that chose for him. It wasn't from a courtroom or a spreadsheet, it was from this very garden, another night that had begun with music and ended in silence. The hotel, years ago, had celebrated the first major philanthropic award with his name on the walls. The city shone, and he shone with it, proud of his own newly polished biography. He slipped out of the main room to answer a phone call and, on the way back, detoured down the path of the rose bushes. He came face to face with a soaking wet woman, her cheap coat held up by a button that insisted on opening. She recognized him immediately and asked bluntly why the management van had removed the boxes from her store 2 hours early. He responded with the language of contracts, speaking of clauses and deadlines, and suggested she look up the legal number. She raised her hand, shaking with cold and fury, and said that the number that mattered was the one for the mornings she would never get back. He looked away from her to the lights of the room and offered her money right then and there, as if a single sum could cover a crumbling floor. She refused, and he felt a second of shame, a thread he cut hastily, as if it were possible, in life, to press, ignore. It was the first time the garden looked back at him. That thread which he cut never undid. A security guard approached, ready to remove the woman, and he, in a gesture as automatic as it was cowardly, nodded, authorizing the story to be dragged out of the frame of his event. The man was the same one who today held an umbrella without rain. That night, the security guard applied protocol, asked for identification, took down names, gently pushed aside what didn't fit into the party. Before disappearing through the gate, the woman said something he pretended not to hear. "The garden reminds me." He went back in. The violin picked up where it had left off. Now the memory returned whole, uncut, and with a detail he hadn't known he knew. On the soaked coat, a red thread ran from the shoulder seam to the cuff, the same color as the dress that years later would wait for him among the rose bushes. The past wasn't an archive, it was a circuit. He looked at the woman he loved and saw in her eyes the recognition of this history that never had glasses raised in toasts. She didn't shout, didn't demand loud interest. She simply held the velvet box with a care that seemed almost like a prayer for something that would never be. Delivered. He tried to construct a sentence to bridge the gap between them, but another flash prevailed. The office, that mahogany desk, the early morning he'd drawn with a pen, a contract addendum shortening vacancy deadlines. The clause was an emergency invention, concocted after a meeting with investors who demanded speed. He signed without breathing, repeating his father's mantra, a man who never asked permission from time, "Don't look back." And yet, everything that reached him now came from exactly where he hadn't looked. The woman in red noticed the change in his face, the moment when arrogance gives way to lucidity, and lucidity to terror. She took 2 steps closer and, beside her friend, formed a line with her shoulders as if marking a boundary that would never be crossed again. She said she had also been here years ago on this same displaced stone, helping her mother catch her breath after being removed from the salon for not fitting the society column photo. He said he remembered the expensive perfume that washed over them like a warm wind before a storm, that he remembered how an elegant man spoke to a security guard with his eyes, not his mouth, and that he remembered, above all, silence, that preferred instrument of those who never wanted to get their hands dirty. Each word filled the garden like slowly rising water. He wanted to apologize, but he learned too early to negotiate regrets like someone negotiating fees. His apologies stuck in his throat, because before him, regret wasn't currency. It was inventory. Photos, dates, call logs, cold, time-stamped messages. The woman he'd come to meet said little, but revealed much. The emails answered by assistants at 6:02 a.m., the meeting with residents cancelled under the guise of schedule adjustments. The document with her signature in blue ink, as clear as the glint of the puddle reflecting off her shoes. That was when the most forbidden memory came flooding back to him. Not a public scene, but the night he alone returned to the garden after the event, guided by a nameless nuisance. The lights were already dimmed. Waiters were sweeping crumbs from a floor that had known expensive laughter. In the background, sitting on the stone step, a boy fiddled with a broken bracelet. The boy looked up and asked if it was true that grown men could do anything. He responded with a lie that now resounded. He said grown men can do almost anything as long as they know how to pay the price. The boy smiled with the way of someone who didn't understand. The bracelet, he would later discover, had been a gift from his mother to ward off nightmares. His mother was the woman with the soaked coat. The boy grew up watching the house dismantle into boxes, the neighborhood become a showcase, and learned that beautiful promises have a point. He was in the garden again tonight. It was the man with the umbrella. The revelation didn't come as a formal accusation. It came as a thread that finally connected all the dots. He saw his own phrase return like a boomerang, know how to pay the price. The price was there, in flesh and silence. The boy had grown up without his mother's store. The woman in red had grown up without the neighborhood that called her by name, and the woman he loved had grown up learning to distrust everything that was quick and perfect. He, who believed he could buy time with decisions, realized that the real bill is always paid with time. Other people's time. The rain returned, light, as when the world breathes after a confession. The red dot of the camera no longer mattered. There were older witnesses in the place, the stones, the rose bushes, the half-open window. He finally opened his mouth and said he was ready to make amends. He didn't promise checks or awards with his name on them. He spoke of returning the block where possible, of buying back contracts to undo them, of giving up pieces that supported the edifice of his own reputation. The woman in red inclined her head, listening without giving in, and the other kept the velvet box closed between her hands, like someone holding on to something that shouldn't be thrown away, but still unused. The garden, attentive, waited for the next choice. Because remembering isn't enough. Karma, he realized, isn't the punishment that falls from the outside, but rather the path that one's own hand has traced until it returns to the same place. The silence that fell wasn't simply an absence of sound. It was a strategy. The woman in red stared at him as if measuring not the height, but the strength of a structure about to collapse. The woman he loved remained motionless, but the weight of the velvet box in her hands was almost a sentence. He realized he was no longer the protagonist of the evening. He had become a defendant in a court, where the rules changed depending on the judge's gaze. Then the game began. First, with questions that seemed trivial but carried the hidden blade, dates of forgotten meetings, names of homeless families, details of contracts he had signed without reading. Each hesitant answer was a brick removed from the wall that had always protected him. Then came the quotes from public statements, his own quotes clipped from newspapers and events, phrases about social responsibility and commitment to the community that now sounded ironic in light of the facts. The woman in red walked in slow circles, the toe of her heel clicking on the wet stone like a precise metronome. With each step she brought another document, another memory, another face. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The embarrassment came from the relentless math between what he'd promised and what he'd delivered. In the midst of this, the woman he loved asked just one question, without changing her tone. How many times have you believed that you didn't need to look back? He wanted to answer, always, but he understood that, here, sincerity would just be more evidence against him. So he lied with a few, and the lie echoed in the garden like a stumble too loud to go unnoticed. The rain grew heavier, and the sound of drops hitting leaves created an almost theatrical backdrop. She, the woman in red, moved closer until he could smell the cool scent of her perfume. She whispered that tonight he wasn't just revisiting mistakes, he was being watched by someone who never forgot. The man with the umbrella reappeared in the distance, this time without the umbrella, his hands exposed. He stood in the light and stared at him in a way that made time seem heavier. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was a reminder that some stories don't need sound to continue existing. That's when he realized that what was at stake wasn't just his reputation. It was his ability to stand up under the gaze of those who knew his most convenient version of the truth. And that ability was quickly slipping away, like paper in water. The woman he loved opened the velvet box, took out the ring and held it between her fingertips. The stone caught the light for a moment, but instead of handing it back, she dropped it onto the wet stone. The dry sound that followed was small, but it carried a weight greater than any formal sentence. He bent down to pick it up, but the woman in red stepped in front of him, blocking the gesture. "Leave it," he said, and the word sounded like a definitive command. And that's when he knew he wouldn't get anything back that night. Not the ring, not the trust, not the control. The betrayal didn't come with screams, nor with the fury of slamming doors. It came as a restrained whisper, as cold as the drizzle that was beginning to weigh down the flowers in the garden. He sensed it first in the gaze of the woman he loved. There was no open anger, but a calculated distance, as if she were already somewhere else, even though she stood before him. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind of pause that precedes a precise cut. The woman in red broke this pause with a short sentence. She knew from the beginning. He didn't understand right away. He looked at the woman he loved, searching for any trace of denial, but found only a serene face, unable to defend itself, because there was no need. "You knew I was here, you knew who I was, and you knew the garden wouldn't be the place where you'd defeat me," the woman in red added. It was then that the truth fell into place like a piece he hadn't wanted to find. The Woman he loved had not only allowed this encounter, but had precisely engineered it. She had brought him here not to hear promises, but to make him see and feel the weight of his own past. He remembered small conversations over the past few weeks, seemingly innocent questions about old businesses, about neighborhoods he barely remembered regenerating. He remembered how she listened to his answers with a silence that, he now understood, wasn't acceptance, but recognition. Everything had been a carefully paved path until that night. The ring still lay on the ground, reflecting the damp glow of the street lamp, but now it seemed a functionless object. The gesture he had prepared, to kneel, to propose, to seal a promise, no longer made any sense. The promise was broken before it even existed. The man with the umbrella, until then motionless, took a few steps, getting close enough for the sound of his shoes to echo on the stones. He stopped behind the woman in red, like a bodyguard of a truth that needed no weapons to be lethal. His eyes, steady and dark, were those of someone who carried the memory of the boy on the stone step, the innocent question and the cruel answer. The woman he loved finally spoke. "I'm not here to destroy what you have. Time will take care of that. I'm here to make sure you never forget what you took." There was no hatred, but a clarity so sharp it hurt more than any accusation. He tried to find a defense, any narrative that would cast him as a victim of greater circumstances, but all he found was his own reflection in the puddles on the floor. A small man, cowering under the weight of the story he had written. The gate in the background creaked, not from the wind, but from someone leaving. The woman he loved turned away, followed by the woman in red and the man with the umbrella. Neither of them looked back, and there, alone, he understood that the betrayal was not in the fact that they exposed him, but in the fact that they had been by his side, long enough for him to believe he was loved. The first pang came in his stomach, as if his body understood before his mind. The damp chill of the stones seeped through the soles of his shoes, up his legs, and every muscle seemed to stiffen under the weight of a silence no longer shared. The garden, once the scene of secret meetings and silent promises, now surrounded him like a dead-end corridor. He bent down to pick up the ring, not out of love or hope, but out of reflex, like someone trying to reclaim something that proves he still has control. But when he touched it, it was almost bitingly cold. It wasn't just metal. It was the solid summation of everything he'd lost that night, not just the woman, but the right to believe he could rewrite his own story without paying for it first. The rose bushes, heavy with rain, leaned over the path. Each falling petal seemed to mark an invisible countdown. Then a distant metallic sound cut through the air. It wasn't the gate. It was something deeper, like a lock being released or engaged. The camera's red dot still blinked, but now there was a second dot, farther away, almost hidden in the shadows. Someone else was recording everything from a different angle. He felt his skin crawl. They weren't the only ones who knew the story. There were witnesses he would never see but who would know every detail. A movement in the shadows caught his eye. The man with the umbrella reappeared, unhurried, this time with a new envelope in his hands. He walked over and handed it to him without a word. The paper was dry despite the rain, and inside was only one photo, old, grainy, black and white. In it, a woman smiled in the doorway of a shop, holding a child in her arms. Above the door, the name was hand-painted. The shop he had closed with a signature. The child was the man with the umbrella. He tried to speak, but the man was already walking away, leaving him with the image clutched between his fingers. The weight of the photograph was greater than that of the ring. It was evidence, it was a memory, it was an accusation and a sentence all in one. A trickle of blood ran down his finger, probably from a sharp edge in the photo frame, but he didn't care. He watched the drop fall to the ground and mix with the rainwater. The color faded quickly, but he knew that if you looked closely, there would always be a trace. It was at that moment that he understood the true scope of what was happening. It wasn't about money, about contracts, about reputation. It was about scars, the ones he'd left on others and the ones he would now carry. In the distance, footsteps echoed as they left the garden, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared. He stood alone, the ring in the palm of one hand and the photo in the other, the sound of the rain becoming the only voice to keep him company. He stood still for too long, as if waiting for the world to return an answer that never came. When he finally looked up, he saw that the side gate remained open, and the street beyond seemed more distant than ever. He pocketed the ring and the photo in his wallet, almost superstitiously, and walked slowly to the exit. Before he crossed, a voice behind him, hers, asked him to wait. He turned with a start he couldn't hide. She had returned alone without her friends Red, without the man with the umbrella, and there was a kind of weariness in her gaze that didn't ask for permission. She said she had one last favor to ask, and it wouldn't involve money or lawyers. He nodded reflexively, with the docility of someone who understands they no longer control their own night. She took a deep breath and explained in simple sentences what remained of all the letters, photos, and memories. There were residents still in legal dispute. There was a makeshift daycare center in a church basement. There were merchants trying, with the door half open, to continue paying rent already adjusted twice. She wanted him to go there, tomorrow. Early, alone, without press, without staff, without grandiose promises, and listen. Just listen. She asked him not to bring letterhead, to leave the expensive watch on the nightstand, to appear with his face clear of apologies. He opened his mouth to promise worlds, but she raised her hand and said that promise was stage language. The favor was just presence, and presence, at that point, would be the only form of truth he could offer. The request, small compared to his fortune, seemed immense. Compared to his pride. He felt an old automatic resistance rise in his body, the same one he used every time he had to say no to something that yielded no return. But something had cracked, and the sound of that crack still vibrated in the rose bushes. He asked if, by doing so, they could see each other again, talk calmly, perhaps start over from a different place. She bit her lip without sentimentality and replied that she didn't know. That love, when it exists, doesn't reappear by agenda. It appears by consequence, and that consequences to be born need solid ground. The night seemed to contract. He gathered what remained of his courage and said he would go, that he would arrive before the children, that he would wait outside until someone allowed him in. She thanked him with a discreet nod and warned him that she wouldn't be there to mediate anything. It was him with the people, without translation. The next request came in a whisper that hurt him more than any document, that he go to the old block, the first one he'd signed without looking closely, and walk slowly past the glass display window that replaced the shop in the photo. That he press his palm against the cold facade for a full minute, trying to imagine the warmth of the hands that once pushed open that wooden door. That if he could, he close his eyes for that minute and let the sound of the street invade his head until the past made its noise. He said yes again and realized that the word, repeated, began to feel different, less automatic, more weighty. The garden watched him, and from that gaze began to emerge, for the first time, the feeling that the favor he'd asked was, in fact, a ritual. Before leaving, she took a step further and returned the velvet box. She didn't open it. She simply placed it in his hands and asked him to guard it as one guards a book without an ending. He said that if the moment before the glass ever made sense, perhaps the story would find another form. If not, that the box should remain closed, so he would always remember the size of the things you don't touch when you don't hear them. He held the box tightly, fearing that its tiny weight would slip through his fingers. He promised he would go, that he would return, that he would write letters to the right people. She, without arrogance, repeated that letters this time only after hearing voices, and she turned her back on him, crossing the gate as if returning the night to its rightful owner. The silence. That knows the truth. He stood still for a few seconds, then walked. There was no background music, no redeeming phrase. There was the sound of his own footsteps and a humble urgency that crushed his chest in a new way. Inside the taxi, he looked out the window as if searching for a sign in the dark. He touched his wallet to make sure the photo was there, touched the jacket pocket where the box weighed, and allowed an old shame to emerge without makeup. The last favor had settled in like a secret commitment, the kind that, if broken, doesn't see scandal but emptiness. And he, for the first time, was afraid of emptiness. He woke before the sun, as if his body knew that, from then on, the right time would no longer be his. He left his watch on the dresser, put on a simple shirt he never wore, and left without a driver, without a planner, without a golden route. He arrived in the church basement, still smelling of freshly brewed coffee and damp paint on the walls. The makeshift daycare center breathed in the leaning strollers, the crooked drawings taped together, the small backpacks with names written in pen. He leaned his back against the door and stayed. He didn't introduce himself, didn't make a speech. He listened. A woman spoke about the rent going up twice in a year. A man showed her the contract with lines he recognized as the handwriting of his own fear. A mother, her voice broken, said her son doesn't sleep when moving trucks pass by. The sentences fell, without rhetorical effect, and therefore were heavy. He tried to write them down, and with each word, he realized there was no room for grand promises, only for small decisions that, together, changed the ground. When they saw him as the owner, the air thickened, but no one left. The same woman who had waited for him in the garden was gone. Her absence was a kind of compass. If he needed guidance, he hadn't yet understood the request. So he chose to start with the simplest and most difficult: suspend. He picked up the phone and, in front of them, asked the legal team for the immediate suspension of pending evictions, the review of adjustments, the freezing of ongoing construction. He didn't use fancy words. He used short verbs. He heard the automatic resistance on the other end, learned to say now, like someone closing a door that had always been ajar. When he hung up, the room didn't applaud. It just breathed. Then he walked to the block that inaugurated his biography of conquests. The glass display case reflected back a reflection he couldn't quite fit inside, so he placed his cold palm against the smooth shine and closed his eyes. A minute can be a continent when carrying weight. At first, he heard nothing but the traffic. Then a faint murmur appeared, like a memory meeting a hallway, voices calling customers by name, laughter coming from behind the counter, the doorbell that would never ring again. He opened his eyes and, on the other side of the glass, a boy placed his hand on the same spot. He didn't know who he was. He didn't need to. The doubled touch, separated by an inch of world, explained more than any audience. He took a step back and understood that the minute had made sense, not because of the vision of the past, but because of the new weight of the present in his hands. On the way back, he stopped at the office and asked everyone to enter the meeting room without laptops or introductions. He spoke for the first time about returning, not donating. He didn't name anything after himself. He explained that he would create a community land fund, transferring ownership of specific properties to a non-profit entity managed by residents. The capital would come from the sale of shares he himself would relinquish, and the contracts would be public, the minutes open, and the decisions auditable. There was shock, a quick calculation in the eyes of those thinking about price quotations, and a threat from the board. He chose not to negotiate with his own fear. He announced that until formalization, no one would speak to the press and that he would be solely responsible for any losses. There was no heroism in this speech, only the anticipation of pain. Late in the afternoon, he went to the cleaners' union of the hotel that once commemorated his name. He found the man with the umbrella leaning against the railing, the worn jacket of someone who had long since ceased to need to appear larger. No one greeted him warmly. He asked them to walk in silence to the garden, now empty, the stone still holding the memory of the previous night. He asked for forgiveness without flourish, with a voice that trembles when there is no audience. The other man listened to him, standing, hands in his pockets, and replied that forgiveness erases nothing, but opens a narrow path where one passes without hiding. He also said that if he stumbled, no one would rush to catch him from the cameras, that there was no absolution, only work. Before leaving, he wrote short letters by hand, not to the newspaper, but to the people who had said, "I stayed outside." Exact names, memorable moments, a commitment to attend meetings without security lines. He folded each letter like folding a bandage. He left an envelope on his secretary's desk with his resignation signed in white, in case midway through, the board decided to halt the process. It was a gesture of war against its own ease. That night, back at the apartment, the velvet box felt heavy. As he took it out of his pocket, he didn't open it. He placed it next to the phone like someone keeping watch. Outside, the city sped along at the same pace, but he realized he was now half a step behind, and it was deliberate. He looked at his own reflection in the window and almost didn't recognize himself. Not because he had become someone else, but because he had finally stopped interpreting himself. He grabbed his coat and, without planning his words, went downstairs. There was a choice. That didn't fit with connections or documents. He wanted to return to the garden, without a letter, without a camera, without an audience. The gate was locked. He smiled at the belated lesson. Some doors don't open at the right time. He leaned his forehead against the cold iron, and in that simple gesture decided what he would do at dawn. Convene the board, announce the suspension of dividends, announce the fund without banners, hand over the keys to the designated properties, accept the resignation if it came, and most of all returning to the church basement not once, but as many times as necessary so that the moment before the glass wouldn't become just a ritual. The choice, finally, was no longer to survive one's own fall, but to learn to fall correctly, with one's arms out in front of oneself so as not to knock anyone else over. The day of the meeting arrived under a grey sky, the kind that leaves the city without shade. He arrived early, crossing the building's lobby, with measured steps, as if he already knew he wouldn't receive applause at the end. The room was filled with advisors, lawyers, and shareholders. On the table, the plan for property return, the creation of the community fund, and the suspension of dividends occupied the front page. It was the same table where he had so often signed off on expansions and acquisitions with a confident smile. Now, the weight was different. The beginning was predictable. Questions about losses, projections, and the impact on market value. But as he responded firmly, without sugarcoating the numbers, he realized the mood was shifting. There was no longer discussion about if he would do it, but about when and how it would be executed. Each calculated attack was accompanied by a slanted look, not just at the decision, but at the fact that he wouldn't back down. In the middle of the meeting, an aide entered discreetly and placed a manila envelope on the table. He recognized the handwriting in the corner. It was hers. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single handwritten sentence: "The garden remembers. No signature. No need." He tucked the paper into his inside jacket pocket, took a deep breath, and announced that at the end of the meeting he would resign. Not as a theatrical act, but so that the process wouldn't weigh heavily on him. He explained that he would only stay until the properties were fully transferred and the trust was formalized. Some tried to dissuade him, others remained. Silent, the kind of silence that isn't agreement, but acceptance that something irreversible has been set in motion. On the way out, he ignored the press gathering at the door. He walked to the old block. He stopped in front of the storefront window, placed his hand against the glass as he had promised, and closed his eyes. He wasn't expecting anything, but the reflection of a small hand on the other side overlapped his own. He opened his eyes. It was the same boy from last time. The boy didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply held his gaze for a few seconds and then retreated inside as if he had fulfilled an invisible role. Late in the afternoon, he returned to the hotel garden. The gate was unlocked this time. He entered without attracting attention, walked to the displaced stone near the rose bushes and sat down. He took the velvet box from his pocket and, for the first time, opened it. The ring gleamed in the soft light, but not as a symbol of romantic promise. There, in that moment, it was a weight, reminding him that some gestures must be made even when there is no one to applaud. He didn't notice when the woman in red appeared. She stood before him, expressionless. "Did you do what you needed to do?" he asked. "I did what I promised," he replied. She watched him for a few seconds, then held out her hand. He placed the box in her palm, and she closed her fingers around it without looking inside. "The rest is not up to me. It's up to time," he said, before turning, and disappearing the way he came. The sun was already setting, and the garden lights were coming on one by one. He stood there, feeling the cold stone on his back, until he heard light footsteps behind him. He turned, but saw no one, only the sound of wet leaves and the distant reflection of the camera's red dot, which blinked once before going out. He walked out the gate, feeling as if he hadn't finished anything, only altered course. Karma hadn't arrived as a sudden ruin, but as a constant shadow, reminding him that every step from now on would be measured by what had already been done. In the pocket, next to the paper with the phrase, "The garden remembers," the old photo remained folded. As he passed by on the sidewalk, he placed it on the ledge of an open window. He didn't look to see who would take it. He simply walked on, with the cold on his face and the certainty that somewhere in the city, the story that began with a letter in the garden would continue to be told, perhaps without his name, but with the mark of everything he couldn't erase. And as he walked, he realized that for the first time, he didn't feel the need to defend himself from what he was. The real turning point wasn't in what he'd lost, but in what he'd finally agreed to carry. The garden remembered. And now so did he. If this story has captivated you thus far, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter in this series of encounters and reckonings. In the next video, you'll discover what really happened the morning after the assembly, and why a new letter, delivered anonymously, could change everything again.